On Newsnight Scotland tonight, the Scottish Conservative leader has said she reckons only 12% of Scottish households make a net contribution to the national wealth. All the rest of us receive more in public benefit than we contribute in taxes. A view can be regarded as controversial. Good evening. The dust has yet to settle over the nation's high-quality debate on universality of services, but already Ruth Davidson has lobbed a new pebble into the pond of public finance. 12% of Scots households, she says, make a positive contribution to the national balance sheet. Everyone else takes out more than they put in. The public sector in Scotland is too big, she argues, and the way forward is to stimulate private enterprise. We'll hear from Ms Davidson in a moment, but first Jamie McIver reports.
Is Scotland's public sector too big? Are too few of us actually generating wealth, rather than benefiting from public spending? The Scottish Conservative leader thinks so.
It is staggering that public sector expenditure makes up a full 50% of Scotland's GDP, and only 12% of households are net contributors, where the taxes they pay outweigh the benefits they receive through public spending.
Critics dispute the claim that just 12% of Scottish households are net contributors to the economy. The SNP says the calculations were written on the back of an envelope, and some economists are also sceptical.
I've certainly never seen that figure used, and quite how they get there is difficult to say. But it would be interesting to see what the UK figure was, because I don't think the UK and Scotland are that out of line with each other. So if the Scottish figure is 12%, then perhaps the UK figure is very similar. In which case, is that staggering as well? But it's a pretty, I mean, as a stark figure, it's pretty meaningless on its own.
The Scottish Government argues public spending actually makes up a lower proportion of gross domestic product in Scotland than it does across the UK as a whole. 44.1% when oil and gas is included, against 46.5% for the whole UK. But regardless of the figures, is there an underlying problem in Scotland's economy? Is the balance wrong between the public and private sectors?
Balance is the key factor, actually, that we have more people bringing in money than we have spending it, which is the opposite way from the moment. And we need to get the size of the public sector down a little bit and rebalance our economy. We've been asking this for some time, and it's something that takes some years to do, but it's certainly something that all parties should focus on doing.
Scotland's private and public sectors don't exist in isolation from each other. Some businesses, including many construction companies, rely on the government or councils for a significant proportion of their work. In short, taxpayers' money sustains some private sector jobs.
The public sector can facilitate, as it's doing very well just now, a number of infrastructure programmes, and that's really important if we look at the fourth crossing and things that are vitally important to the economy. So it's wrong to see the public sector in some way damaging the economy. It doesn't do that, but we just have to have a larger private sector driving forward and bringing in income.
The problem with cutting the size of the public sector significantly is that few would comfortably argue for fewer teachers, nurses or police officers. Efficiency gains can only go so far. But can public services be provided in a more efficient way, one step removed from the state? For example, in Glasgow, the libraries and museums aren't run by the council directly, but by an arm's-length trust. And what role can businesses or charities have providing services, either replacing those currently provided by the state or complementing them?
What do the public want their money spent on? What do they expect as a result of these service deliveries? And then how do we deliver the service? It's not automatically all directly hands-on government controlled.
And this also touches on the debate about what the taxpayer can and can't afford. Last month, Labour announced a full review of things like free prescriptions for all. And yesterday, the Prime Minister stressed that certain universal benefits were off limits for Conservatives.
Let me be absolutely clear. The promise I made at the last election to Britain's pensioners, when I said we are not going to take away your winter fuel allowance, your free television licence, your free bus pass, that promise stands.
So does this mean the challenge is simply about making sure taxpayers are getting the best value from the public sector and growing the private sector? Sentiments few in the mainstream would actually disagree with. Or is there an argument for fundamental change?
Well, I'm joined now from our Birmingham studio by the leader of Scotland's Conservatives, Ruth Davidson. Thanks for joining us. Many Tories there think the coalition government hasn't been radical enough, that it needs to shrink the state. Do you think that needs to happen?
Well, I think we have to look at the record of the coalition government. We've seen a reduction in the public sector. We've seen more than 1 million jobs created in 2 years in the private sector. So I think the movement of travel is going in the right way.
And in that speech today, you said only 12% of households are responsible for generating Scotland's wealth. Where did that figure come from?
Well, I'd like to correct your introduction, if I may, David. These, aren't my figures. These are figures when we were looking at the speech. We were wanting to enter the mature debate that I believe is beginning to happen in Scotland finally about our spending patterns, how much we're spending and what we're spending it on. And we asked the independent Scottish Parliamentary Information Service what the net contribution ratio was in Scotland. They came back to us with a 12% figure. It's based on the ONS baseline plus the Scottish uplift and the Scottish Government's GERS figures. So it's all from official data.
12% of households are responsible for generating Scotland's wealth. That's what you said in your speech. The problem with that, of course, is that lots of people are working, lots of people are doing a responsible job, lots of people are supporting the highest earners and working for businesses. They don't seem to be included in that.
Well, I think what's staggering about this figure is, we're talking about households here who have an income of £50,000 and are paying thousands of pounds in tax, sometimes tens of thousands of pounds in taxation, and possibly weren't aware, and certainly I wasn't aware, that the public sector spending was so high that they weren't considered net contributors by the measure that the independent Scottish Parliamentary Information Centre gave us.
You're saying, though, that only 12% are responsible for generating Scotland's wealth. That's quite slightly different, isn't it? In effect, you're saying that those people are the only ones who are creating something, contributing something, the rest are just taking away. Is that your position?
Well no, and indeed the way in which the SNP have overreacted on this in terms of going for the spin and calling me Mitt Romney and all sorts of things, rather than addressing the substance of public sector spending in Scotland, shows just how rattled they are about this. Do
you think that pensioners ought to contribute? Because I'm not sure if you included pensioners or not in your figures.
Well, it depends very much on income. It's an income and taxation based ratio that the Scottish Parliament's Independent Information Service gave us.
OK. You talk about the size of the state in Scotland. Where's the evidence that a strong state, big government, is bad for growth? There's plenty of countries where actually growth has been relatively good. Sweden, for example, long term, its growth has been every bit as good as America, and it has a big government rather than a small government.
Yes, and America's growth has been every bit as good as Sweden's, and it has a small government rather than a big government. So I guess this is where we get onto the debate, which we're trying to have, or at least several of the parties in Scotland are trying to have in Scotland, and we see the SNP trying to run away from addressing some of the issues. Quite frankly, I welcome Joanne Lamont's late conversion and coming onto the ground that the Scottish Conservatives have been holding for some time, and I welcome the intervention of independent figures like the former Auditor General Robert Black getting in on this debate too. What I'm worried about is the SNP are attacking the messengers rather than addressing the message. And, for example, instead of giving Scots the information that they're requesting, they're using taxpayers' money to go to court to stop information being released. They're voting down perfectly reasonable amendments in Parliament where we as Scottish Conservatives asked the SNP to give us their own projections for how much things like free personal care would cost into the future, like free tuition at universities would cost into the future, and they refuse to give us that information. So there are several people in Scotland and several parties in Scotland that are trying to have a mature debate on the issues and to talk about substance, and all we're getting from the SNP are the lashing out, trying to attack the messengers,
but they're defending
and not to use any information.
They're defending the status quo. I return to the question I just asked. What evidence is there, other than your opinion, that it's a good idea to chop the state?
Well, I think, as you previously stated, there are several different models for running a country. Many small state countries are very competitive, have good rates of growth. I believe, as somebody who's right of centre, that that's the best balance for our country. I actually don't think that having a strong private sector is a particularly controversial position in the Western world, and that's the way in which we want to take Scotland forward.
OK, if you're looking then at cuts and reducing the size of the state, what sort of benefits will have to be cut? Is it things like the winter fuel allowance? Is it things like free TV licences for pensioners? Where does the axe fall?
Well, in the Scottish context, we've talked very clearly about where we want changes to happen. I mean, I don't particularly like the funding model, which sees hundreds of millions of pounds over the course of a parliament being paid to prop up Scottish Water. I don't particularly believe that most people across Scotland want to get free aspirin when they see people with rare cancers not getting the drugs that you can get elsewhere in the rest of the country. And I think what's really encouraging is that we're at the start of this debate. Now, I'm not saying that I'm bringing forward a manifesto right now for the 2016 election, but we're starting to talk about the issues in Scotland. I welcome all of the contributions that are substantial that are going across the country on this. I just wish the SNP would quit the rhetoric and get on with the substance.
The reason I asked you about winter fuel allowance and free TV licences is because David Cameron has said absolutely these will not be chopped. These are things that he is committed to. Now, why is it right to keep that sort of universal benefit and cut all sorts of other universal benefits here? Why is it bad in Scotland when it's so right in England?
Well, it's about personal choices, and actually things like the winter fuel allowance aren't just for England, they're for the whole of the UK, David. And what I'm saying is that we want to look at the mix of universal and selective benefits. We want to use, for example, the contributions that people make throughout their working life to make sure that there's a state pension. That is a universal benefit. But I don't believe there should be universal free prescriptions. It's about political choices. There we must leave it. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Ruth Davidson there, leader of Scotland's Conservatives. Well, joining us now is Leslie Riddick, writer and commentator with a specific interest in how things are done in Scandinavia. Also in Edinburgh, the writer and commentator Bill Jamison. Thank you both very much for joining us. Leslie Riddick, that speech today was aimed at the Tory faithful. It jars with many here, but does she have a point? The state? Is the state getting in the way?
No. Today's been a baffling day all round. I mean, not only did we hear from Ruth, but then George Osborne went on to talk about workers becoming owners of companies by giving up some of their employment rights to be able to own shares in companies. We've heard a suggestion that housing benefit might be cut for under 25-year-olds, half of whom live with children. This is quite heady, horrible stuff, actually. And it suggests a kind of diametric opposition between welfare and wealth. You mentioned yourself the example of Sweden. The Nordic countries manage, like bumblebees that shouldn't be able to fly, to be able to combine high levels of wealth, a pretty vibrant private sector, and very high levels of high quality welfare, which all their citizens choose to take benefit of. And one of the questions I've got about this debate is, never mind the universalism debate, never mind who's entitled to some of our services. The thing is that so often people opt out anyway. People are paying, if you like, in tax for health services, and then some people have private insurance. People pay in their taxes for an education system they choose not to have their own children go through. Now, if we really want to look at the things that concern some of the most successful societies our size, the Nordic Council's main concerns about welfare now are, number one, declining quality, because that means, number two, there will be less solidarity in society.
Okay.
And that's what they're aiming for. Why don't we?
Bill Jamison, that 12% figure that Ruth Davidson is quoting, it sounds pretty controversial. Do you think it's accurate?
I'm not sure it tells us actually very much, because I think we should take out of that figure the sector of the population that is of pension age or in retirement. I think it's a bit unfair to say that they have not contributed. They have certainly contributed over the 40-odd years of their working lives. If you take out pensioners from that equation, if you look at working households, you perhaps get to a more interesting figure, and that is, I think, about 39% of working age households are getting more in benefits than they are paying in tax, and that percentage is up from about, I think, about 29% in 1979. So I think Ruth Davidson is right on her direction of travel, on her critique. I'm not quite sure if putting in pensioners into that equation really enlightens the argument.
And Leslie Riddoch, you were saying there today that the debate is really out of the comfort zone. Is that the direction we're heading in Scotland? Are we now, as a nation, going to have to confront some of these awkward choices, or will the issue just rumble on and be sort of kicked into the long grass? Well,
I think we could usefully start to discuss some of the things that we know happen anyway. We look at the universal benefits issue. It's about £800 million. I understand that's 2 to 3%. 2 to 3% yes. of the Scottish budget. Meanwhile, there are other difficulties, like 1.5 billion, it's estimated, is spent on pensioners being admitted to hospital, emergency admissions when those pensioners end up not actually having any kind of injuries. Sometimes there's a panic in the middle of the night, sometimes they're in pain, and to be on the safe side, they're admitted. That speaks volumes about the lack of support in their own community. Now, that's a big issue about benefits. It's a big issue about the welfare state. And that asks lots of questions, really, about how well empowered people are, where they live. And it could call forward a completely different way of looking at how we manage to integrate care so that communities are powerful enough to take care of their own folk, which is actually what people would really want to see happen. But that's a challenge about silos and control, and it's a sort of administrative and bureaucratic challenge that isn't as sexy as arguing about these headline figures and these universal benefits.
In the meantime, Bill Jamison, there's just this focus on middle-class benefits, and there are, as you heard there, many pensioners who are looking at this, wondering if those benefits will continue. It's a difficult sell, isn't it, for the Conservatives to say there needs to be more of a squeeze on middle-class benefits, because ultimately many of their voters will benefit from them.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a difficult sell on both the left and the right, and I think Joanne Lamont has been equally courageous in raising this issue and suggesting that actually we've got to look at this whole issue of universality. If we just go to the some very simple figures that were laid out in that wonderful document, the Independent Budget Report by Crawford Beveridge, came out 2 years ago, that clearly set out the, if you like, the unsustainability of universal services, and he put that on the table, and the report said to Alex Salmond that early action had to be taken to address this. Now, nothing has since happened. The only problem is that because of the delay, it's got more expensive to address,
Leslie
and we will have to address it.
Leslie Riddoch, you've looked at Scandinavian countries. We imagine them to be very high spending countries, but we also see there, don't we, that, for example, when you go to the doctor, you sometimes have to pay for it. Are we ready for that sort of thing here?
Well, that's it, yes. That's in Sweden and Norway, it's about a £20 charge to go to the doctor. In Norway, you get an exemption card after you've spent £200 up front. But that's a very tiny proportion. It's about 7% of their total expenditure. But let's look at it this way. They also have a cap of a maximum of £200 a month on kindergarten care. Now, we are black and white. You either have it completely funded by yourself, in which case actually childcare is unaffordable for practically everyone, or you may get it for free. Now, somewhere we need that, for example, that kind of really excellent service.
There we must leave it. Leslie Riddoch, Bill Jamison, thank you both very much indeed. Just before we go, time for a look at the papers. Daily Mail, my pledge to save the Union. David Cameron declaring saving the Union is the most important priority for the government. The Independent and all the other papers, lots of pictures of Boris Johnson. That's all from me. Good night.